Hey guys, this is going to be a simple video about some of the basics for creating the illusion of distance in our artwork. Of course, we work in a flat 2D medium, so it's important for us to understand how we can kind of make it seem like we're actually looking back into space and creating that illusion of depth and dimension to our artwork. So the first main factor in doing that is with contrast. And of course, if you look at the world around you, your eyes work in a very basic way of creating a focal point where everything is focused and crisp. And then behind that, you have everything slightly out of focus, so it's less crisp and less focused, I guess you could say. But we can recreate that in our 2D medium by using contrast. So you might see here we have a black circle. And that creates a lot of contrast from the black against the white with a very sharp edge. So if you just look at the page quickly or close your eyes and look at it, your eyes will be driven right to here. So this becomes a artificial focal point. So we're trying to recreate that three-dimensional feel. So we need to create a focal point for your eye. And then of course we want to create some other stuff. So maybe if we had another black circle here, right now they're the same, they have the same amount of contrast. So your eye would probably just kind of be driven to that general area. But if we soften it up, let's see, thick and thin? Sure. If we soften up this one just a little bit, try to make it softer around the edges. There we go. Then suddenly it loses a little bit of its contrast because it doesn't have this sharp black on white, but instead it has grayscale and it kind of bleeds into the white background. So this becomes our main focal point and this becomes our second focal point. So that way it creates the illusion that this is in front and this is behind, simply because that's how we're used to viewing the world. We see the focal point and everything behind it is less focused, so we're used to seeing this be in front of this. I hope that makes a little bit of sense, and let's bump it up a little bit since this is still black against a white background. It still has a lot of contrast going for it, so if we were to say go over it a little bit, suddenly it jumps way back into the background. Because there's a lot less contrast going on. This is more like a mid-tone 50% gray against a white background, and so forth. You can keep bumping it into the background until it's gone. But you can see there, that's kind of the basic for how contrast recreates distance in our work. And let me do a couple more examples. One would be with line weight. So that's a circle. Oops, let me switch brushes. Okay. So there's one circle, and then another circle. This one on the so the circle on the left should be drawing more of your attention because it is a thicker black line. So therefore there's a greater kind of ratio of black against white. So that creates kind of more contrast in the most basic way. Versus something over here. Let me kind of exaggerate a bit more, something like this, which is a thinner line. So when we talk about line weight for showing distance, it's kind of this basic concept that the thicker the line weight, the more contrast you're creating. So you're creating a kind of false focal point, and if you were to say draw something, let's see, what can I draw? Let's just draw like a finger or something. So we create kind of the thickest part, and then we go back, and let's just say whatever. Oops. I don't know. Let's just say there's some finger and it's pointing at you. So that should help sell the illusion that this part of the finger is coming toward you, because it has that thicker line weight, and therefore it draws your eye initially to this part, and then maybe your eye works backward, and you can even go farther back with thinner lines and whatnot into space. And even though this is just a flat collection of lines, it feels like this part's farther forward, And this part goes backward into space. And that was a terrible hand, and I apologize greatly because I am lazy right now. So let's just get rid of that hand for now, and let's see if there's any other examples. But I want you to just understand how kind of focus and contrast go hand in hand. So here's two circles, and let's just kind of make them similar for now. Is this one, that one? And I'm going to try to make their contrast levels pretty similar for now. So they might feel like they're at the same distance, I should say. Hopefully. Let me do a little more highlights. So I'm just going to select the blur tool just to showcase how closely linked focal point and contrast is. So obviously this is a photo tool, but you'll see both these spheres appear to be at about the same distance, but if you start blurring one, you'll notice that the other one suddenly pops from the screen and suddenly feels like it's way out ahead of the other one. You can even kind of do this even more with the Sharpen Tool, which all the Sharpen Tool does is create contrast, and all the Blur Tool does is it gets rid of contrast, so it kind of makes gradients between everything. But the Sharpen Tool just kind of adds more blacks and more whites to create this kind of false contrast. So there, all of a sudden, this one's really jumping far forward, and your other sphere is obviously way into the background. So I think that's it for contrast. Let me just move right on to the next example. So the other basic key I want to talk about is saturation. So saturation, I will write it out. Obviously, when we see the world around us, because of the wavelengths of light and everything like that, the things that are closest to us are more saturated. They have more color in them than the things that are real far away. And this also has to do with a other thing, which goes with atmosphere. So that's kind of another factor of saturation. So atmosphere, and it's important to kind of, I always like to in my head do like a checklist to make sure like my backgrounds are less saturated than my foregrounds, because I sometimes see people make that mistake and it ruins the depth of your piece. So for instance, if you had a background that was, say, bright blue here, let me get a different brush. Bright blue background like this, and the foreground was say a red, but it wasn't that saturated. So let's like this. That really doesn't sell like the depth of something that well. This feels like it's very far back into this space. So if this was supposed to be a foreground element, it just doesn't read that well, especially against this strongly saturated blue background. So versus, say, let's say take something more desaturated. Say this is our background. Ooh, let me make it lighter so it looks more. So this is our background, and let's take the same value, and this could be our foreground object. So this circle should feel like it's a lot more closer to camera than this one over here. And just to show that this is all based on saturation, I will take my tonal control and adjust the colors just to get rid of the saturation completely. And you can see here there's really no difference. They both look like there's a circle on against the background, and since there's no real contrast, they both look like they're kind of blended in back. Nothing really pops out at you. But obviously when you do it like this, the saturation of one creates that illusion that it's a lot closer to you than the other. So let's do one more example. There are some other tricks you can use to create distance, especially if you're limited and you don't have a lot of background features, a lot of places where you can show different contrasts and saturations. One other trick for showing distance is with repetition and scale. So let's just make a big object here. Let's see. There we go, but we need something slightly more distinctive in order to sell our repetition. So let's just draw some ears on this and make it into a happy bunny face. So there we go. There we go. And you can be sad because you're having to learn about distance. So let's just copy and paste another object real fast. And free transform. Make it nice and small. And then move it over here. Okay. So now we have our two bunnies, and since one is smaller, it looks like it's farther away. But this property actually doesn't carry as much weight as contrast does. So instead of that, we can actually take this and use our blur tool once again. And if we blur this larger object, we'll notice that it suddenly looks like it is in the background. Simply because contrast is the greatest factor in determining distance. So we can see this one, nice and sharp, seems to be ahead of this one, which is all blurred out. But there is another factor to consider, and you might be thinking to yourself that this is still behind this object, but it is the focal point, and the focal point is behind this object. So this has to do with foreground figures and foreground objects. And since this object here shares the saturation and value of this one over here, you can probably get away with considering it a foreground figure. In fact, you can probably simulate that even better by adding a little bit of motion blur, and this simulates the effect of both your eyes seeing an object before it reaches the focal point. So it kind of has that double vision effect. But otherwise, if we want to push this into the background, we'll probably need to lower the contrast and value a bit. So the saturation will go way back. There we go. But we can simulate that even more by adding a shadow under this object, as well as a shadow under this object. And there, using the grid lines, this definitely is ahead of this one. So I think that's about it for the main factors that go into showing distance. And the main thing I want you to take away from this video is just to kind of have that checklist in your head anytime you're doing an illustration, to look at your background and foreground and make sure your background isn't drawing more contrast than your foreground. So you want to avoid like thick black lines. If this was your background, it would kind of very off-putting. So you want to have those kind of softer contrast levels in the background. And also the saturation. You don't want your background to be more saturated than your foreground. So if you have like a background object that's very saturated, that's not going to look as good. It's going to be more off-putting versus, say, having lower saturation in the background. So that's just the stuff to think about, and always have that checklist in your head. And I hope this video was somewhat useful. And I guess that's it. So thanks for watching.